Good day. The most interesting revelation about the state of the military conflict in Ukraine today comes from the British Ministry of Defence, which has provided its usual defence intelligence update. These are routine defence intelligence updates, which it provides on a daily basis. And I'll just read it out because this is what it says. Over the last week, Russia has continued to make small advances in its attempt to encircle the Donbass town of Bakhmut. The MO3 and the H32, the two main roads into the city for Ukrainian defenders, are now likely both threatened by direct fire following the Russian advances. Earlier in the week, Wagner paramilitary forces highly likely seized a subordinate road which links Bakhmut to the town of Siversk. Whilst multiple alternative cross-country supply routes remain available to Ukrainian forces, Bakhmut is increasingly isolated. Now, alternative cross-country supply routes suggests supplying Bakhmut across open fields. I don't think this is actually a practical option if we're talking about heavy equipment, armoured vehicles, ammunition, fuel, food, that sort of thing. So I suspect that Ukrainian troops could withdraw from Bakhmut over these open fields, but I doubt that the city, the town, the troops in the town can be kept supplied for very much longer, always assuming, of course, that what the British Ministry of Defence is saying is true. Now, what makes that all rather interesting is that the head of the Wagner organization, Yevgeny Prigozhin, is now actually taking a more, shall we say, guarded view about the situation in Bakhmut, about the state of Bakhmut's encirclement, than the British Ministry of Defence is. Whilst the British Ministry of Defence appears to accept that the Russians now have effective fire control over all the main roads that lead into Bakhmut and which were used by the Ukrainians to keep the garrison in Bakhmut supplied, Prigozhin continues to insist that this is not the case. He accepts that the more southerly of these two roads, the one that passes through Ivanivka, is under what is now referred to quite regularly in discussions of the war as fire control. It can be shelled, in other words, by Russian artillery. The Russians are now said to be edging even closer to Ivanivka itself, as well as to Chasov Yar, further west. Some reports I've seen now put them only a kilometre away from the village, and of course the road passes through the village, and modern artillery, even less modern artillery, can easily strike a road that is just a kilometre distance away. So clearly the southern road, the road that passes through Ivanivka, is under direct fire control, but the more northerly road, the one that apparently originates in Konstantinovka, I'm not sure about the layout of the roads. Well, that road, Prigozhin continues to insist that the Ukrainians can continue to use, and he appears to feel that it will only come under full fire control, Russian fire control, once the two villages of Krasnaya Gora and Paraskovyevke are brought under Russian control, with fighting going on still in both places. By the way, whilst I'm on the topic of Prigozhin, he's also somewhat deflated claims that had been appearing last night in the Russian media that Ukrainian troops have pulled out of northern Bakhmut. The Russians have broken through into Bakhmut from the north, as well as, by the way, from the south, from the area of the village of Opitnoye. And there's been fighting, as I've said, for some time going on in the residential areas. But last night there were reports that the Ukrainians had been pushed back from the residential areas of northern Bakhmut, that they've been pushed towards the center of the town, with the impression being given increasingly that only parts of the town can now be said to be in Ukrainian control, as opposed to the situation, say, a couple of days ago, when the Ukrainians were still in overall control of the town, even if the Russians occupied parts of it. I'm choosing my words a little carefully there, but I think you get the overall gist of the point I'm trying to make. Well, Prigozhin has denied this. He's come out and said that there's no sign of any Ukrainian retreat from any part of Bakhmut. Ukrainian troops continue to put up a heavy resistance in every building, every street. Everyone has to be fought for. The Russians are pushing forward, as he says, but they're still meeting intense resistance as they do. Now, I come back to my previous observations about Prigozhin. He likes to deny that something has happened just before it happens. And the reason he does that is because he wants to make absolutely sure that he's the first person to announce authoritatively either the encirclement or the capture of a particular place. And when that happens, he wants to make sure that it is his own Wagner organization that gets what he considers to be the right share of the credit. Well, I am not on the ground in Bakhmut, obviously. I'm not physically there. I don't know exactly what is going on in Bakhmut. I'm seeing this accumulation of reports, including, by the way, a very, very sad one from a Ukrainian soldier who gave an interview on a Ukrainian chat to a Ukrainian journalist and describing the nature of the fighting in Bakhmut, and said that an untrained soldier thrown into the fight in Bakhmut has a life expectancy of 4 hours. Now, that's what this Ukrainian soldier is reported to have said. Obviously, I don't know whether that is true or not. It might be an exaggeration. I don't know how this particular soldier has that kind of information. I don't know whether he keeps a time on the life expectancy of the soldiers all around him. Perhaps we shouldn't take it too literally. But anyway, the point that he's making must surely be a valid one, that Ukraine is suffering very heavy losses indeed in Bakhmut, trying to hold Bakhmut, what President Zelensky still insisted it will do, defend Bakhmut. Well, maybe not to the last man, but as Zelensky said, up to the point when they can no longer do so. And this soldier has just given us some idea of the price that is being paid for this, a price which, let me say again, I don't very much understand. Now, a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago, seems much longer now, but short time ago anyway, I remember just before Soledar fell, a Ukrainian soldier in Soledar was interviewed by, I believe of all agencies, CNN. It was over a telephone line, and he accepted that Soledar was about to fall, even though at the time he was still insisting, as was by the way the case, that there were still some Ukrainian holdouts fighting on in Soledar. And this soldier also said that he'd received no orders either to retreat or to surrender, and that some kind of a retreat had taken place by some military units, Ukrainian military units from Soledar. And this made him feel betrayed to some extent, because he and his comrades had been left behind without them being told that that would be the case. Anyway, this soldier, whilst bravely insisting, that the Ukrainians were still fighting in Soledar, begged the question of why. He said that Soledar was bound to be captured by the Russians. So why all this sacrifice of lives to defend a place which was, to all intents and purposes, already lost? Now, that was true of Soledar. It is true of Bakhmut as well. I've been arguing since August that Bakhmut is undefendable, or rather would not be defended, could not be defended in the face of the forces that the Russians are deploying for an indefinite length of time. I've suggested that the point has long been passed when Ukraine should have pulled back from Bakhmut. The United States has been giving Ukraine the same advice. We hear that others have been doing so as well. The BND, the German intelligence agency, has come forward and informed the Bundestag that they're worried about the price Ukraine is paying to defend Bakhmut. All of us are baffled by this Ukrainian decision to cling on to Bakhmut for as long as they've been doing. There's all sorts of theories as to what is the case. There's said to be a big honeycomb of tunnels under Bakhmut, as there were, by the way, under Soledar. These are presumably the product of the salt mining that goes on in this area. And it's been suggested that the Ukrainians have all sorts of secrets that they're trying to hide there. I've even seen some suggest that tactical nuclear weapons may be located there. Well, I know nothing about that, and I've seen no evidence so far that this is the case, but I'm perfectly willing to believe that the Ukrainians have been hiding something in these tunnels. I would say that when Soledar was captured, the tunnels were apparently searched, though I doubt that they've been searched very thoroughly in the short time since Soledar fell. But anyway, there has been some kind of a search, and it doesn't seem to have come up with anything very interesting. We had the same kind of speculations about Mariupol and what was being hidden in the labyrinth below the Azovstal steelworks. And, well, the Russians did go on searching through the various tunnels and bunkers that had been built under the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol. But again, nothing of any significance appears to have been found there. And I'm going to make a guess. I don't think personally that anything of any very great significance is hiding in the tunnels or below either Soledar or Bakhmut. I don't think one can find an explanation for this determination of the Ukrainian leadership to cling on so grimly to these places, long past the point when it made any strategic sense for that to happen. I think that this is all down to some kind of psychological factor. I've seen some people suggest, I've had an email, by the way, suggesting that apparently a member of Zelensky's family died fighting in Bakhmut, and this may have hardened his determination to hold on to Bakhmut, lest the sacrifice of this family member be in vain. Well, I have to say that is the calculation that President Zelensky is making. I think it's a bad one. I think it's a wrong one. I think the leader of a country at war should not let those kind of factors, personal factors, influence his decision making. But there we are. There may be all kinds of reasons, or it could be connected with internal Ukrainian politics, and we're going to come to those fairly soon. But anyway, lots going on in Bakhmut, but all the indications are that even if the ring around the Ukrainian garrison there has not closed tightly, even if it's still possible for some people to go in and out, and I noticed, by the way, that it's some time now since any Western journalists were able to visit Bakhmut itself. The one nearest to the fighting that I know of, Roland Oliphant, seems to be some distance away in Chasov Yar, which, by the way, he is reporting that most of the civilian population is leaving. They fully expect that there will be a battle in Chasov Yar very soon. But anyway, the nearest reporter, Western reporter that I know to the fighting area is Roland Oliphant, who writes at the Daily Telegraph. And I noticed that he has not himself been to Bakhmut at any point over the last week, 2 weeks or so. Something, by the way, which I think is extremely wise and which I commend him for. I think it would be most reckless and irresponsible to try to enter a town like that in the middle of this kind of battle, getting himself trapped, causing problems for his family, but perhaps also, more importantly, causing problems for the Ukrainian troops who would be defending him. Anyway, that is the situation in and around Bakhmut. Now, yesterday, I talked about the fact that there was all sorts of activity on other parts of the front line, in Vuhledar, in Zaporozhye, in the northern area of Kremenaya, Svatovo, Kupiansk, etc. I've now seen what appear to me to be reliable reports that in order to prevent a collapse of Vuhledar, Ukrainian defenses in Vuhledar, Ukraine was obliged to transfer troops to Vuhledar from the Bakhmut area. So that perhaps to some extent accounts for this reduction in brigade totals that Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama has spotted near Bakhmut. It's fallen from 27 to 18. The Ukrainians have been forced to reassign troops primarily to Vuhledar, but I suspect also before long to other places, other parts of the front line as well. And I'm going to quickly say that, in my opinion, if the ring around Bakhmut isn't yet tight, isn't yet fully sealed, within the next couple of days it will be. And any Ukrainian troops unfortunate enough to be still within this ring, inside Bakhmut, when it closes tight, will in effect be trapped and will have to face the difficult choice of either fighting on to the end or going into captivity. Anyway, we're not quite there yet, but we're coming very close. And I'm going to say straight away, I sense, especially after reading this British military intelligence update, a sense that the end game in Bakhmut is now upon us. Before I finish, I should say that British military intelligence updates need to be handled with great care. The British often give what I find strange interpretations of what's going on the battlefields. Is they are writing about the situation in Bakhmut in the way that I've just read out, then that does confirm, to my mind, conclusively, that the situation there is very grave indeed. Anyway, to move on, lots of speculation now about where the big Russian offensive, the spring offensive, is coming. And I'm going to go back, first of all, to Roland Oliphant, because, as I said, we have fundamental disagreements about this conflict. That is indisputably the case, but he has been, when he's on the front line, a reasonably reliable reporter of the state of the battle. And he's written an interesting article in the Daily Telegraph. I'm not going to read it. It's behind a paywall, and it's rather long. But anyway, he's written an interesting article discussing where this Russian spring offensive might focus upon, what part of the battlefronts the Russians might attack from. And he suggests that perhaps Svatovo, Kremenaya is a possibility, or the eastern Donbass, presumably exploiting the advantages created by the fall of Bakhmut. Or it could be around Sumy, closer to Kiev. And after all, General Zaluzhny was talking a few weeks ago about a potential threat to Kiev. But then, of course, we mustn't overlook the possibility of an advance from the south as well. And there are large numbers of Russian troops there, and this is apparently ideal tank country. So, the spring offensive, the Russian spring offensive, alternatively may come from the north, the east, or the south. I don't think we've learnt very much from that. And the Institute for the Study of War has provided a similarly, I think, vague discussion of where this spring offensive will come from. And I'm not going to comment on it in any further detail, except to say that it is absolutely clear that the Russians have the West utterly baffled about this. The Western powers, were caught by surprise when the Russians pulled their troops out of Kherson region. They were able to pull them out of Kherson region without either the Ukrainians or the Western powers really noticing. I can remember the British military intelligence update at that time talking about the great difficulty of pulling these troops, these Russian troops, across the Dnieper River, how this would be an operation that would probably take several days, how they might have to leave some of their equipment behind. And in fact, by that point, the Russians had already pulled across, taking nearly all their equipment with them. So the Russians were able to keep everybody fooled and guessing about that. And they've also succeeded, so far as I can see, in keeping everybody fooled and guessing about this offensive that they are perhaps, probably, presumably planning. And I've been following the reports very carefully. I can't help but think that if Western governments knew where this big offensive was coming from, what direction it was going to take, by now something of that would have leaked out to the media. And the fact that nothing like that is appearing, that we're getting these strange articles which basically say, well, it could come from any place and in any direction, that tells us that the Russians have successfully managed to keep their plans fully secure. And that has some rather interesting pointers, because it suggests that the Russians have an extremely effective control over their secrets and their secret discussions, because I'm sure there's been a lot of planning and discussions there. It suggests that whatever Western or Ukrainian intelligence operation is operating in Moscow or closer to the front line in the headquarters has essentially broken down. The Western powers perhaps don't have spies who manage to infiltrate the higher commands of the Russian military. It's an interesting fact in itself, or the Russian political service. And as I said, the result is that everybody seems to be left guessing. And it's curious that with all this vast amount of intelligence that is gathered through satellites, through signals and all of those sort of things, that isn't proving particularly successful either. And again, on the question of signals intelligence, it looks as if the Russians must be operating pretty tight discipline in terms of their signals, and presumably many of their signals are coded, and it looks as if, again, the West, the Ukrainians, haven't been able fully to break the codes. Or perhaps they have, but that this is so secret that this information can't be shared, in which case it's to all intents and purposes useless. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say on that particular point, but I would say this. Whatever the Russians are planning to do, I do think that the fighting in Vuhledar is for real. Ukraine has redeployed significant forces to Vuhledar, which shows how important this relatively small town is for Ukrainian defenses in southern Donbass. I don't know whether the Russians have been reinforcing their positions around Vuhledar, but I suspect that the Russians will indeed make a major effort at some point over the next few weeks to capture Vuhledar. And for what it is worth, British intelligence seems to think the same thing, that Vuhledar is a real serious target for the Russian military. Further north, the Russians are continuing to press forward in the Svatovo, Kremenaya, Kupiansk, Liman area. They seem to be generally continuing to advance in this area. But the big Russian forces that are known to be located in this area, the big tank armies equipped with their T-90M tanks and all of that, they've not yet been committed to the battle. So it suggests that the Russians are continuing to shape the battlefield in this area, and one wonders to what end and for what purpose. And again, I would personally be surprised if this fighting in this particular part of the conflict zone isn't for real as well. It should be said that when the Russians pulled back across the Dnieper River from western Kherson region, abandoning Kherson city, they were able to stabilize the front lines in Kherson region. The river, the Dnieper River, provides an enormously strong barrier. The Russians have built up a layered fortification system on the east bank of the Dnieper River. There have been various penny packet Ukrainian attacks, attempted Ukrainian attacks, trying to cross the Dnieper River, trying to capture particular islands in the Dnieper River. All of these attacks appear to have failed, and apparently with heavy losses. And the Russians have stabilized fully the front line in this area. Whereas the same is not true to the same extent further north in the Svatovo, Kremenaya, Kupiansk area. The Kharkov offensive was, in my opinion, a bigger blow for the Russians than the Kherson offensive was. It did weaken their positions overall in northern Donbass, in Kharkov. It's exposed Belgorod region in Russia to more attacks, and Putin had a meeting of his Security Council to discuss, so far as one can tell, precisely this issue just the other day. So I would have thought that the Russians regaining ground in this area where they lost ground in Ukraine's successful Kharkov counteroffensive of the autumn, regaining ground here is probably important for them. And at the very least, I think that we will see some kind of Russian push to try to push the Ukrainians back across the Oskol River. And given that the Oskol River itself is a very small river, relatively easy to cross, I would not personally be surprised if we see a bigger Russian offensive in this area shaping up over the next few weeks. But anyway, those are my guesses. But since everybody's guessing, so far as I can see, I don't see why I can't add mine. Anyway, I'm now going to discuss briefly the situation with military deliveries. And I should say somebody didn't particularly like my comments about tanks and air support, even though they were supported by articles I've read in the media in the West, especially in the British media. And this person particularly took issue with me about the scale of the Turkish Air Force. He said that the Turkish Air Force was small. It was a small, relatively small Air Force operating clapped out old F-16 fighter jets. Now, about the second, I can't say. I don't know how advanced or modern Turkey's fighter jets actually are. But according to open reports, Turkey has or fields a force of 270 F-16s of various variants, of which 86 are said to be of the D variant, whatever that means. Now that looks to me like a big air force, and I'm not claiming that, I'm not making direct comparisons in terms of capabilities, but for the sake of comparison, Britain, the Royal Air Force, has 101 Typhoon fighter jets and 29 F-35B Lightning fighter jets, and the German Air Force has 141 Typhoon fighter jets with 38 more on order. So, and apparently there's also 35 more on order. So, though I have no doubt at all that the German and British Air Forces are more modern, more up-to-date, use better, more advanced fighter jets, perhaps have better pilots, though I wouldn't say that for sure. It does seem to me that with 270 F-16s, Turkey at the moment is operating more fighter jets than either Britain or Germany. And while, as I said, I'm not making direct comparisons, all I will say is I can't see that it is a small air force, that the Turkish Air Force is small. Anyway, I just wanted to make that point. Let's move on to the really important issue, because it's now becoming apparent that there are more and more problems with the tank deliveries. Germany has committed itself to supplying 14, very much over the opposition of the Bundeswehr, the German military. It made that delivery under enormous pressure from its various allies, Britain, France, the other European countries. Chancellor Scholz didn't want to supply Ukraine with tanks, but was pushed into doing it, partly by all this external pressure, partly because of pressure within his own government from the Green leaders, from Annalena Baerbock and Robert Habeck. And so he reluctantly agreed to this delivery, and the delivery duly took place. And he then made a speech in which he said that the Germans, the Europeans, had agreed to create 2 battalions of tanks in Ukraine, provide Ukraine with 2 battalions worth of tanks, around 88 tanks in total, at least 88 Leopard 2 tanks. As I said, I've never understood where the British Challengers fit into this picture. And it's clear that Scholz was expecting that other European countries would then come forward and supply their own tanks. After all, they all ganged up on him and put pressure on him to supply the Leopard 2s and to authorize the export of Leopard 2s. Now, I've noticed since that announcement was made about 10 days ago that there's not actually been a huge rush of countries across Europe publicly announcing that they're supplying Leopard 2s to Ukraine. And I'm now reading in the German media that the Germans are now beginning to wonder whether other countries are indeed going to be prepared to part with their Leopard 2s. Some of them are in bad condition. Some are needed by the militaries of these countries. There's a great deal of reluctance on the part of the militaries to part with Leopard 2s. And so far, the pledges to supply Leopard 2s to Ukraine from the other European countries have been few and far between. Greece, of course, has categorically ruled out any idea that it will supply tanks to Ukraine, and it is one of the big users of the Leopard 2. And it seems that the Germans are now starting to feel that they were taken for a ride, that they were maneuvered into making this announcement that they were going to supply Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine on the assumption that others were going to do the same. And now that that's happening, they are frankly annoyed and angry with their so-called partners because they're not coming forward and they're not supplying Leopard 2 tanks. And there's now serious queries about whether these 2 battalions worth of Leopard 2s are indeed going to appear anytime soon on the Ukrainian battlefields. Well, I'm not going to speculate about this. I would have thought that this is such a politically charged and embarrassing issue that the pressure is going to be there very much on to drum up the necessary numbers of Leopard 2s. But again, we come back to this question: how quickly can these Leopard 2s be supplied? If they're supplied in dribs and drabs, then the temptation for Ukraine to use them in dribs and drabs will be almost irresistible, given the scale of the Russian forces that are now deployed. And in the alternative, if they are supplied more quickly, some of them might not be in particularly good condition. One gets the sense that militaries across Europe do not want to part with their working, up-to-date, reliable Leopard 2s. They're going to prefer to pass on their, shall we say, less well-maintained Leopard 2s, and that the Leopard 2s that Ukraine will get will not therefore be in particularly good condition. And of course, we always come back to the problem of training with these machines. It may not be possible to do that to anything like the level necessary or needed to enable these Ukrainian forces to operate these Leopard 2s effectively on the battlefields. Well, we're already seeing problems, therefore, and I've just seen another complaint from a high military British official. He says that if Britain found itself in a shooting war with the Russians, Britain would run out of shells in a day. In other words, it would not be able to sustain for any length of time the level of combat that Ukraine has had to sustain. It would run out of shells within a day. And he suggested that in order to bring the British Army up to strength, the British government needs to allocate £3 billion a year over a 10-year period. It would take 10 years to modernise the British Army, to bring it back up to strength and up to date, and that would require a commitment of £3 billion each year at a time when Britain's public finances are under extreme stress. Maybe it will happen. To be frank, I question whether it will, but perhaps the bigger point that's being made is with the British military so depleted, with the German military so depleted, with European military so depleted, is it really practical? Is it really rational to go on shipping whatever weapon systems are available to Ukraine? And the Ukrainians are now talking increasingly about the enormous forces that are being built up and gathered by the Russians against them. Alexei Arestovich, Zelensky's former spin doctor, who was sacked about 2 weeks ago, he's now issued another bleak comment. He says that the forces that the Russians are gathering are on a scale that Ukraine has never faced before at any point in this war, that the Ukrainians will for the first time be outnumbered on the battlefields. An interesting admission, by the way, because at one time the Ukrainians were saying that their forces numbered 700,000 men in total, whereas the highest number I've seen given for the total Russian forces, Russian Wagner Group, Chechens, Donetsk, Donbass militia, is 550,000. So if it is indeed the case that the Russians will shortly outnumber the Ukrainians on the battlefields, well, then one does wonder how high Ukrainian casualties are. It's an old story. I'm not going to return to that further. I discussed it at length yesterday. But anyway, Arestovich said that these forces that are coming together are enormous, and he didn't say that Ukraine is definitely going to lose against them, but he did speak about this as being a massive trial that Ukraine is going to face, and it's not difficult to see his doubts. And all of this is happening whilst the political turmoil in Ukraine continues. There's been suggestions that the defense minister, Alexander Reznikov, is about to be sacked. The Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, is apparently in active discussions about this, and a MP from Zelensky's party, which I think I'm right in saying is the only party now still represented in the Rada. Most of the others have been dissolved or abolished or whatever. Anyway, he's come forward and suggested that the person who will replace Reznikov is Kirill Budanov, who is the head of Ukraine's military intelligence. He's been very active and very visible lately. And in our various programs, Alex Christoforou and I on the Duran have been speculating that he is indeed maneuvering for some high position, and Defense Minister looks like it could be the one, the immediate one. Anyway, we shall see. So lots of problems in Ukraine, perhaps more problems with the tanks that are supposed to be coming from the West. And I still insist on the points I made yesterday about the enormous difficulties of supplying Ukraine with F-16 fighter jets and of the difficulty of operating these tanks on Ukrainian battlefields without the necessary air cover. It's been widely commented upon in Western media, and I've no reason to doubt that it's true. But let's move on and look at the other side of the hill, what's going on amongst the Russians, because there's been more and more comments about levels of Russian arms production. And it's necessary here to point out that the man who seems to be in overall charge of Russian arms production is Dmitry Medvedev, who is now deputy chair of the Security Council, Russia's highest policy-making body, in other words, directly subordinate to Putin, and he is also deputy chair of the Military Industrial Commission, which supervises the work of the defense industries. Now, he's been making all kinds of claims recently that Russia is increasing its production of weapons, and I'm starting to get some reports that seem to confirm this, so that I've just seen a report that production of Lobayev sniper rifles has apparently increased by multiple fold. Production of anti-tank weapons has increased by 5-fold. That's the most intriguing glimmer of a report was one which said that the Russians are able to replace every big cruise missile attack, they're able to replace all those cruise missiles that are used in these attacks on Ukraine. They can replace them all within the space of a week. That their production, in other words, is equivalent to their weekly production, is the equivalent of one big missile attack on Ukraine. Now, that is intriguing. I should say that there's no doubt at all that the Russians are building more cruise missiles. I read a report the other day that there's been an examination of the debris of one of these cruise missiles, a recently launched KH-101, and this is a report in the Western media, and it appeared to confirm that this particular missile had received modifications to make it more stealthy and to maneuver more effectively in order to bypass Ukrainian air defenses. So we can see that the Russians are updating their weapon systems all the time, and that must of course mean that they're drawing on weapon systems not from existing stockpiles but from new production. But if it is indeed the case that the Russians are able to replace all their missiles, all the missiles that they expend on a big strike in Ukraine within a week, then that does beg some questions as to how many missiles the Russians are producing. Because what is a big missile strike? Now, these can vary, as I've noticed, between around 20-25 missiles in a single strike, but there have been some strikes where the number has been higher, up to 80 or even 90. Now, if we're talking about replacing all the missiles used in a missile strike of, say, 20 missiles over the course of a week, then that would mean that Russia is producing 20 missiles a week, say 80 missiles a month, which is actually a lot of missiles, a lot of cruise missiles. But, of course, if they're producing in a week the equivalent of an 80 missile strike, then that increases dramatically, and we're looking at over 300 missiles being made in a month. Either way, it's a lot of missiles, but if it's 300, well, the situation is not going to be good for Ukraine. It could be that the Russians, in fact, are not only making missiles, but might even be stockpiling them. I don't think it's 300 missiles or anything close to that, not at this stage of the war. But for the record, I think Russia does have the capacity to build as many as 300 missiles a month, but I suspect that that would require considerable reorganization of the production base and extensions of the production base and investments, all of which, for all I know, are actually happening. But one way or the other, the Russians seem very, very confident that military output is going to increase very considerably this year over last year, and that their armed forces are going to be equipped with large numbers of very modern weapons over the course of this year. Now that, by the way, suggests a number of things. Firstly, that hopes that the Russians are going to run out of weapons are misplaced. Secondly, that if the Russians are building up military production at this kind of speed, then this isn't just to equip the huge new forces that they're going to be raising for the long term, and which were discussed at that Defense Ministry meeting a few weeks ago, which Putin attended. It suggests that they must be building up large forces to win the war in Ukraine itself. And that also suggests to me that the offensive, the Russian offensive, is going to take place, the big offensive, isn't actually happening, and perhaps isn't going to happen over the next couple of weeks. But it is going to come when more of these weapons have been available, have been made available, and have been distributed to the units. More shells, more missiles, more aircraft, more tanks, more infantry fighting vehicles. There was a report just the other day that the Russians have just received or delivered to their army another batch of BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, for example. So, a huge tidal wave of men and machines is being built up to sweep on Ukraine. And this is, I have to say, something of a contrast to this difficulty that the Western powers are having cobbling together 88 tanks. Now, I've said this many times, I'm going to say this again. I think that the only way out is through negotiation. In my program yesterday, I discussed how perhaps within the United States, the US government, pressures to negotiate before this tidal wave sweeps on Ukraine may be increasing, they may be growing. We've had those reports from the RAND Corporation, from the CSIS, from the IMF. We've had leaks to the Swiss media from German sources about possible discussions of deals done about giving up territory, Ukraine giving up territory in return for peace. We've now seen the former Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Bennett, coming forward, and he's given an interesting account of the negotiations in March. Now, Kirill Budanov, the man who is soon apparently to become Ukraine's defense minister, has come forward and has alleged that the negotiations that Ukraine engaged in the spring, in March, which led to the Istanbul agreement, were not for real, that they were bogus, that Ukraine was simply stringing Russia along, and that was really not a real negotiation at all, which would, by the way, mean that Boris Johnson's intervention in ending those negotiations really didn't matter. I'm a little skeptical about this. If they were just an exercise in stringing the Russians along, why was Johnson and the British and some people apparently in the United States so concerned about them? But put that aside, Bennett, it seems to me, is also calling into question the whole theory that these negotiations were phony. He says that he was initially contacted by Zelensky, that it was Zelensky who played the leading role in getting the negotiations up and running, that Bennett then spoke to Putin, and gained from Putin an assurance that Zelensky himself would not be targeted for attack, which is what has enabled Zelensky to move around Kiev, feeling relatively safe ever since. And Bennett says that the negotiations were essentially moving towards success, but again he says it was outside parties, third parties, which basically brought those negotiations to a stop. And I have to say, I still believe, this is my own personal view, that Johnson did play a decisive role in short-circuiting whatever negotiation was agreed or seemed to be about to be agreed at that time. Having said that, the fact that Budanov is now a rising figure in Ukraine, that he's been talked about as the defense minister, that he's going around saying that the negotiations in March were not for real, is inevitably going to make the Russians think, if he is appointed defense minister, that negotiations with Ukraine are a pointless exercise. Because with Budanov coming along and saying, well, those negotiations back in March, they weren't really intended to lead anywhere. They were just an exercise in stringing the Russians along, getting the Russians to slow down their offensive, persuading them to pull back from Kiev. It was really a ruse and a trick. Well, the Russians might say, well, that's what the intelligence chief is saying, so perhaps we don't pay too much attention to it. But when that same intelligence chief is promoted to defense minister, well, they're going to say to themselves, well, clearly, if we're going to get any proposal from Ukraine for renewed negotiations, Ukraine is not really serious about them. So I'm just making this point because I predict that if there is a move now for serious negotiations from Washington, these are going to now run into major problems in Kiev, which might not have existed in the spring. People like Budanov have got a lot more powerful over the course of this year, and they seem to be gradually gaining their hands on some of the levers of power. Well, we shall see. Anyway, in the meantime, I think putting aside Ukrainian events, and as I said, we do now seem to be in the end game where Bakhmut is concerned. Let's just talk briefly about this balloon that the Chinese sent floating over the United States. Now, this has caused enormous outrage in the United States, perhaps understandably, but I'm going to say this first of all. Firstly, this isn't the first time things like this have happened. I've not seen it widely commented upon, but in the 1960s and 1970s, the United States regularly sent what it claimed were weather balloons over the Soviet Union. Like this Chinese balloon, these balloons floated at extremely high altitudes, beyond the reach of fighter jets, or most fighter jets, certainly of that period, and beyond the reach of surface-to-air missiles. And again, like this Chinese balloon, those US balloons that floated over the Soviet Union at that time were very difficult to shoot down. They were not just at very high altitudes, but they were a difficult target to lock onto. They're mainly air, after all, or at least gas, and it wasn't particularly easy for the Russians to shoot these things down. And the Russians did complain about them to the US, and the US told the Russians what the Chinese are telling the Americans now. These are just the weather balloons. They're not really intended to spy on you. Whereas, of course, the Russians at that time, the Soviets at that time, thought that they were indeed intended to spy on them. And the Soviets took this all so seriously that they actually commissioned one of their aircraft design bureaus, led by a man called Myasichev, to develop a particular type of very high altitude aircraft, fighter aircraft, well, not fighter aircraft, but anyway, aircraft. Looks a little bit like an American U-2, and it was for a while assumed to be an a Soviet-style U-2, a very high-altitude surveillance aircraft. But in fact, it was designed to carry some kind of automatic cannon for these very, very high altitudes so that it could shoot down these balloons. So this is quite a problem for the Soviets then. And of course, the US has discovered what a problem these balloons are now. And I'm going to say that there's been a lot of criticism of the US military for its difficulty in shooting down this particular Chinese balloon. I think people, before they criticize and ridicule in the way that they have been doing, need to recognize that these are not easy targets to shoot down. And the US has finally managed to shoot this particular balloon down, and it's been a difficult thing to do. And the difficulties should not be underestimated. But putting all that aside, what was the purpose of this balloon? Was it really intended to conduct surveillance of the United States? Was it perhaps a weather balloon? Why did the Chinese fly a balloon like this over or the United States, or was it just a balloon that flew off course? Well, I don't know the answers to these questions. I've read various reports now which say that balloons like this might have been useful as surveillance tools in the 1960s and 1970s, but satellite technology has now advanced to much higher levels, and that balloons like this offer no advantages over satellites which operate in orbit and can operate much more effectively and far more safely to keep what is going on the ground, to keep under observation what is going on the ground. So, given that China does have satellites, and I'm fairly certain very advanced satellites indeed, the only assumption I can make is that either this balloon was indeed a weather balloon that, lost its moorings and flew over the United States by chance, or alternatively, it was intended as some kind of provocation, or if you like, some kind of signal to the Americans. After all, the Chinese have had to stomach quite a lot from the Americans recently. We've had visits by Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan. We've had visits by other US Congress people to Taiwan. We've had all sorts of murmurings and mutterings from the United States about Taiwan. There's been all sorts of commentaries in the media in the United States about the imminent threat from China. It would not be entirely surprising. It would not surprise me if the Chinese, tough-minded and calculating people though they are, decided that, well, let's send a balloon flying over the United States, cause the Americans to feel the same sort of anger and injured pride that we felt when they sent Pelosi to Taiwan. I mean, that's a guess or a speculation, if you like, but I do wonder whether that might have been partly what this was all about. Yesterday, I touched on the other theory that I've seen floating around, which is that this was all intended to either humiliate Blinken, if Blinken continued with his trip to China and met the Chinese officials in Beijing, even as this balloon was floating above the United States, or to cause Blinken to call the visit to China off. And of course that might have been the case as well. All of this, of course, assumes that the Chinese did deliberately send this balloon over the United States. But put all this aside, the key point surely is that this whole episode of the balloon has once again demonstrated the extent to which the conflict, the real global conflict now, is not between Russia and America, it is between the United States and China. The Ukraine war is a sideshow. It's not the major concern of the United States. China is. And as far as the Chinese are concerned, it is the Americans who are obviously making the running in this conflict, but the Chinese repeatedly are insisting that whatever the US throws at them, they're able to hit back and that they won't back down. And as I said, if this balloon were sent over the United States in response to Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, well, it would perhaps be making precisely that sort of point. And that, to my mind, brings us back to Ukraine, to the Ukraine conflict, because for the United States, the conflict in Ukraine is a diversion. They've not succeeded in whatever it was that they were going to do, and they're facing a potential debacle there. For the Chinese, it is a distraction of the Americans, and it's actually in their interests, as I've discussed previously, to keep it going. Note that even as the United States shoots down this balloon, even as Blinken calls off his trip to Beijing, even as the two countries, the United States and China, seem to be preparing to fight each other, we're getting more and more confirmation from the Russians, including a discussion about this on TASS, that Xi Jinping will soon be in Moscow. That's where I end today. Thank you very much for joining me today for this program. More from me soon. Remember, you can find us on other platforms: Locals, Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, and Rockfin. Remember, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon.